Video games are one of the most unique ways to show art and tell a story. A world in control by the player is one of the most immersive ways to tell a story. However, video game writing is not always super easy to pull off. Making a deep and immersive story is very important. Most games don't have enough interesting mechanics to keep the player interested just by gameplay alone. Stories need to keep a player coming back. So today I will be explaining how video games should write a compelling story, what video games have done right, and why, and what video games have failed, and how they failed. Just like a movie, video games need to compel the person to keep playing. What keeps a movie watchable is its compelling story, so a game needs a compelling story as well. Games used to be based off the gameplay and the mechanics of the game, usually only having a few text boxes to loosely explain a story. Games were simple enough at the time that mechanics were the whole game. For example, the game Pitfall had jumping and swinging as its main gameplay, no story. But when games got more complex, they needed a story. When the 90s came around, games were a lot more graphically complex and believable as a storytelling method. Here's what some of the most compelling games have done story-wise. Step 1. To write a compelling story, a writer will need to have characters that people care about. What's the point of telling a story if the player doesn't care about the characters? The characters need to be likable, especially the main character. The main character needs to be lovable, because they have the most time on screen, and have to be relatable, or at least relatable to the circumstances of the game. Make them interesting too. Give the character a personality. Lots of games have failed this way. The main character is just too bland. Make sure there is a reason the main character is the main character. Step 2. Make the characters fit into the world. A game designer could design a really cool world for the game, but if the story writer fails to make the character fit into the world, then a lot of that factor is gone. What I mean by this, if the character has been in the world for a long time, make sure they know what they're talking about. If the character is new in the world, make sure that they don't all of a sudden know everything about it. Failing to pull these off can be an instant loss of immersion for the people playing the game. If the character does not fit into the world, they feel out of place. It can ruin what the story and the game are trying to convey. Make sure the character has a reason to be in the world. Step 3 is good dialogue. Make sure that the stuff the characters are saying makes sense and fits with the character. Make sure everything the character says fits with their aspirations and feelings. Don't add too much extra dialogue, or the game can get confusing. Make sure it's got all the information needed to progress the story, but also make sure it's not long-winded and confusing. Make it flow like natural dialogue, or else it can become too overdramatic and almost laughable, especially if the writer is trying to portray a dramatic or important scene. Step 4. Don't hold the hand of the player too much. A lot of the time in a video game, it is a lot more effective to show and not tell. Getting to play your way through an awesome scene is a lot more effective than just a cutscene or boring dialogue. Let the player figure out stuff for themselves. Hide stuff in the game. Don't make everything so obvious, and make sure the player doesn't know more than the on-screen character, or else playing the game can be frustrating. Now I'm going to give examples of how games have pulled these off correctly. One of my favorite games story-wise is Grand Theft Auto 4. It has such an intriguing story, and the main character reflects that well. Niko Bellic comes from Eastern Europe to live the American dream and visit his cousin. When he arrives, nothing is as it seems, and he has to make a living through crime. The story makes sense, and the main character, Niko, is portrayed very well. He came to the city for a reason, and he fights for it. The city the game takes place in is Liberty City, a fictional rendition of New York. They portray the neighborhoods as dark and dingy, and the big rich ones as glamorous. Niko knows nothing about the city when he arrives. He thinks he is going to be living in a mansion with his cousin, but he ends up in a dead-end apartment. The game's dialogue is very well written. You can always tell how Niko feels, and Niko never goes against his morals, unless the player chooses to do so, of course. The game doesn't always hold the player's hand, but makes the story up front and easy to follow. Now, another way to tell a game. Dark Souls does this method the best. The game starts off with a short cutscene setting up a story of a world in ruin and barely held together. Now, unlike most games, that's the only cutscene in Dark Souls. That isn't just purely for cinematics. There's little dialogue in the game, and the dialogue that is in the game is almost spoken in riddles. The story is mainly told through the actions of the playable character, boss fights, and item descriptions. The game does not hold the player's hand at all. The player's character knows only what the player knows, making the game a very unique experience. The character is only as good as the player. There is no abilities to make the game any easier. There are good weapons, but the difficulty of the game is dependent on the skill of the player. The better the player gets, the better the main character is. The game's story revolves around fire, and the goal of the game is to kindle the first flame and bring the world into a new age. The story is actually quite emotional. Some of the bosses you have no reason to kill, but have to for the sake of progressing the quest. For example, Sif the Grey Wolf. The game is almost a learning experience for life, and one of the most interesting things about the story is that its difficulty and game mechanics into the story well. The game can be very punishing at first, but for some reason, a lot of people don't give up and push on. The game is very rewarding. What a lot of people call the main story for Dark Souls is not going hollow, not giving up and ending up like the undead enemies in the game. It's almost poetic in a way. A lot of people say the game is a metaphor for mental illness. If you give up, it has... Now, some examples of games that do storytelling poorly. This doesn't mean they are bad games, gameplay-wise, but they have poor storytelling. Fallout 4 has a pretty bad storyline. It's scattered and has a lot of filler. The dialogue is bad because it's very awkward and forced. It doesn't flow like a real conversation. It feels like it was written. The story is interesting, but predictable. And the player doesn't feel much of a connection with the character because we don't know much about him. The whole story feels pointless and confusing. Instead of incorporating the unique world into the story, the game just sends the player to random areas of the map to barely progress the story. The missions also feel pretty similar. The game tried to set up a main quest, but it just doesn't work. The main character's son gets taken away, but we just don't have enough time to get attached to the son. When this twist with the son comes back into play, no one really cared all that much. The story ends in a very mediocre way that I won't spoil. While the gameplay is really good in Fallout 4, the story is not. Fallout 4 is one of my favorite games, and the story is interesting while playing, but looking back, it's not so great. I guess I'll give it props for that. It does keep the player's attention while the game is going on, but afterwards. Destiny was one of the most ambitious games of the PS3/Xbox 360 era. However, the story isn't so great. The story is very cliche and sometimes just doesn't even make sense. For instance, they just add new characters without any context. All of a sudden, there will be a new character without any introduction. That's a bad idea because that makes the characters very unmemorable. In turn, that makes the players not care about Destiny. The downfall of Destiny's story was that most people just skip past the story because the gameplay was awesome and the story just wasn't there. So people just skipped it. This failed horribly because the story later on in the game is actually pretty good, but no one would know that because they just skipped through the story. The story doesn't end too bad. It's not the greatest ending, but it's satisfying for those who invested lots of time into the game. But it's important to hook players in the beginning so they stay invested for the whole game and don't just give up halfway through. That's how writers can write compelling stories in video games. The story is a very important aspect to modern games, especially if the game is a shooter or fighting game. There are a bunch of shooters and fighting games, so if creating one of those games, it needs to stand out from the rest, and having a good story is an easy way to do so.
It doesn't matter who you were, only what you will become.